Thank you, Jeff.
You're welcome.
Well, thank you so much for joining me, everybody, today, and thank you especially to Legacy Family Tree for having the courage to invite me to do my first ever webinar. And I really appreciate all of you for having the tolerance to live with my learning curve here. This is so much fun to be able to speak to so many folks literally around the globe all at once. I'm really excited about this. I'm told actually that about a third of you have heard me speak before, and those of you who have seen me speak before know that I need to jump right to the topic at hand. The reason for that is that I tend to be just a touch ambitious about how much content I tend to stuff into my lectures, and so I need to jump right to it. Starting with what our topic is today, reverse genealogy. Of course, it's all about finding the living. And this is not a formal term. This is just an expression I started using about a dozen years or so ago to describe a lot of the research I do. It really does seem to be catching on. You see a lot more people using it these days, but I wouldn't say it's quite crossed over to common parlance. But the reason I call this reverse genealogy is because traditionally in genealogy, we're trained to start with ourselves and sort of methodically march backwards in time. But this is the polar opposite of that. This is all about taking some tidbits of information in the past and then using them to march forward in time. And that's just why I started calling it reverse genealogy. But again, not a formal term, just an expression I've been using for a number of years. Now, to give you some sense of what this talk is based on, it's mostly based on my personal experience. And it started for me many years ago. I started actually doing genealogy in the 6th grade, so as a youngster. But I really only got into this finding the living over the last dozen years or so. And it was largely driven by actually the American Army. You're seeing in front of you the logo for what's called JPAC, or the Joint POW MIA Accounting Command. Now, this is in the United States. I work purely for the Army. I don't do cases for the other services. But what this is all about is tracking down families of soldiers who are still unaccounted for from past conflicts. And so I've been doing this since 1999. And what I do is I track down these families, mostly starting from Southeast Asia, Vietnam, marching back in time through Korea, World War II, World War I. I've even actually tracked down some family members for people who were lost in the American Civil War back in the 1860s. But this is part of what's turned me into a really good reverse genealogist, because what I need to do is track down the soldier's next of kin, his primary and secondary next of kin, and there's a very strict hierarchy about that. I need to find 3 people with the same mitochondrial, or loosely speaking, maternal DNA, and I need to find 1 relative with the same Y or paternal DNA. And because I've been doing it so long, I have now located literally thousands of family members for the Army. And it's kind of like, if any of you all have read Outliers by Malcolm Gladwell, he has the 10,000 hour rule in there. And that's the notion that if you do anything for 10,000 hours, you tend to get pretty good at it. And at this point, I really have done that. So it's a case of practice, practice, practice. I've gotten pretty good at finding living, if only because of this work that I do with the military. And I should mention, although this is with the U.S. Army, the United States being what it is, a nation of immigrants, my cases end up taking me overseas quite often. Just to give you some sense, my current caseload, I've got cases involving, I'm doing work with Finland, with Holland, with Cuba, which has been really interesting. It's my first ever Cuban case. I'm trying to think, the Philippines and Ukraine. So the focus is, U.S.-centric, not surprisingly, but you'd be surprised how much of it is really global in nature. This work I do with the Army sort of serves as a launching pad for other things I do as well. Some of you may have heard of Unclaimed Persons, which is an organization to help coroners and medical examiners with a really prevalent problem. We become so mobile, we move around so much. What this is these are people whose identities are known. They're not John and Jane Does, but they're individuals at morgues, and the coroners just can't find the next of kin to make notification. And so back in 2008, I actually launched a volunteer group. Some of you listening today may well volunteer for the group. And since then, hundreds of families have been notified about their lost loved ones. The other thing that I do that involves a lot of reverse genealogy is what I call orphan heirloom rescues. And what this is people wind up with other people's stuff. Maybe you buy an old house and you find, say, an old family Bible or family photos in an attic. So people will write to me. I have a little submission form on one of my websites, and they'll just tell me the bare bones information about the items. I then do the detective work to track down descendants of the original item, and the submitter will then return the item to the people, and then I tend to write articles just explaining the steps I took to do the research and about the happy reunion of the item back to the family of origin. And so this talk is based on my experience in all these arenas, doing all these military cases, doing the unclaimed persons, doing the orphan heirloom rescues, and then some other stuff. I've actually worked, for example, with both the FBI and NCIS on cold cases and that kind of thing. But it's just based on sort of practice, having worked a lot of cases over the years. So those are the reasons I've been doing it, but these are some of the most common reasons. And actually that first poll that was just done, it sort of bore this out. The number one reason was finding those distant cousins of yours, finding those missing kin, you know, the great uncle who went AWOL back in the 50s or whatever, tracking him down, finding your second and third cousins who are your family history playmates because they're just as intrigued with your genealogy as you are, since they are relatives. Sometimes that was a slightly lower number. I think it was about 23% or so. Finding reunion attendees. I'll tell you, I first did this actually online way back in the 1990s when a lot of people weren't online yet. I did a family reunion, actually more of a village reunion, for a little village called Osternia, which is over in Slovakia. And I took 40 Americans whose parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents were from this village over there for a reunion. And it took a lot of planning, but here was the thing. In order to make it economically feasible, I had to get at least 40 people to do this, to pay for the airfares and all that stuff. And so even though it was early days in the Internet, I was able to take advantage of the fact that many of us have unusual names, Smolenyak being representative of the village, to track down enough people to get us to that magic number of 40 we needed to be able to do the reunion. But you'll see people using this to find people for their, you know, their high school reunions as well. Any kind of reunion this works for. I talked about the orphan heirloom rescues. This next point here about locating family heirlooms. You could be the kind who actually likes to return them, but this is also useful for tracking down who wound up, whoever wound up with the family items. So maybe you have a situation where you find a mention of a family Bible that once existed, and you might use this to track down who wound up with the Bible. And by the way, just a quick tip, if you do that, I tend to start with the maternal lines just because so much family memorabilia gets passed down from mother to daughter down through the generations. More and more you find people doing it to find DNA participants, oftentimes still for surname projects, but more and more for geographic projects or to solve particular history mysteries. I do this a lot on the TV shows I work on. For example, if any of you all are watching Finding Your Roots on PBS right now, a few weeks ago you may have seen the episode with Cory Booker that involved DNA. They actually only showed one of the genetic stories there, but there were quite a few riddles in his family tree that I tackled genetically, and I had to track down just the right people to provide the right reference samples. And of course this is what I do as well with the military repatriation efforts and unclaimed persons. It's a matter of finding the next of kin, and usually most coroners and so forth have a strict hierarchy about who qualifies as such, as does the military. Reverse genealogy is also used occasionally, literally to save lives. Where you see it sadly most often has to do with youngsters with cancer, leukemia. Maybe they're trying to find bone marrow donors. And of course, if you're related, you have a better chance of being a suitable donor. And so you'll see these efforts. I've seen it with children of Swedish ancestry, of Jewish ancestry, which usually turns it into a worldwide chase, but it can occasionally actually save lives. So these are just some of the most popular reasons for using reverse genealogy. Okay, so when it comes to doing this, there are two basic approaches, and again, like the phrase reverse genealogy, this is not formal terminology. These are just the phrases I tend to use, but I refer to it as broadcasting or seeking. By broadcasting, what I mean is essentially sprinkling virtual breadcrumbs across the Internet, okay, making it easier for the people you're looking for to find you, to trip across you. So this is all about putting as many messages and postings out there as possible. The other approach is what I just call seeking, and this is a more sort of proactive and aggressive approach, if you will. And this means using your detective skills to seek out the people that you're looking for. Now, the bulk of this talk is going to be centered on the latter approach, the seeking, primarily because much of what I do is time restricted. On my military cases, for example, I get 90 days to solve the cases. A lot of stuff I do with the media, with journalists, and with producers, TV shows, that's also very much of a tick-tock situation. And so I usually have to be really aggressive in my research in order to solve the riddles quickly enough. But I wanted to spend a few minutes up front talking about this broadcast approach, because just because I'm going to spend the bulk of the time talking about seeking does not mean that broadcasting isn't also highly effective. So broadcasting, as I mentioned, sort of is sprinkling virtual breadcrumbs. You do it the way you would probably think. You use message boards, message lists, and of course these days social networking. Back in the day we just had the old lists and boards. A lot of people think about using surname lists, but I find that actually locality ones are even more helpful because you're sort of casting your net wider. It's one thing to go for people named Nelligan. It's another thing to go for people named Nelligan who lived in New York City. When you do it on a locality basis, on say a county basis, there's a better chance that somebody who knows something, who went to school with a Nelligan or whatever, might happen to trip across your posting. So I find locality boards and lists very helpful as well. There are specialized resources like military ones, school ones such as classmates.com. There are all sorts of adoption registries. I don't make very heavy use of these particular types of resources. Having said that, every once in a while, they're the only resource that help me complete a case. Every once in a while, they've been absolutely pivotal to a given case. And so depending on the specifics of your situation, you may want to look into them as well. Of course, then we have our friend social networking. I use mostly Facebook and Twitter. I'm on a few others as well. But these have become very useful really just since about 2008 or so. And they've become a tremendous asset for tracking down people. Of course, you can have a website, or these days most people would just have a blog of their own. Where you see people being very effective with this is researching their own roots. So they'll just do a whole series of postings about different aspects of their family history, and over time, their second, third, fourth, fifth cousins will trip across those postings and reach out to them. So it's a really great way to sort of snare those distant cousins out there. And then we have photo bases as well. What I mean by this are just databases of photos, of images. A lot of people know that there are millions and millions of them on Ancestry.com, but there are also some smaller sites such as Dead Fred, you see here, and Ancient Faces. What I love about both of those sites is they're both mom and pop shops. Dead Fred was started by a fellow by the name of Joe Bott and some family members and friends. And Ancient Faces was actually started by a mother-son team. He was still in college at the time they launched it. So I think it's tremendous that these resources are out there and so useful for all of us, and it only takes a couple of people to provide such tremendous tools for us. A little bit of a show and tell here, a couple of quick examples. Here's an example from a surname message board. In this case, I have a Reynolds branch in my family, and they use this. There used to be a Reynolds Family Association, and it had gone dormant for a number of years. And so they used it recently to announce basically that the organization was starting back up again. Here's another example from a locality message board. This is actually an adoption situation. The fellow who posted it is not adopted himself. It's his mother, but he knows that she was born in Jersey City. So he, again, is casting a wider net looking for people. He may not even know really what surname he's looking for, so this makes a lot of sense for him to post on a website devoted to a particular county or a particular location. Here's an example of a website that's used to recruit participants for DNA study. This is for the Williams Project, which you're so lucky if you have any Williams branches in your family tree, because this is one of the best run DNA projects out there, run by Adrian Williams. And this is just an example. He has it out there. It's just sitting there waiting for people to find him, and many have. It's one of the largest surname projects in the world. And then we have an example here of a blog. This is by a woman. She happens to be a professional genealogist, but she blogs a lot about her own family history. And you see she's all excited here that a cousin just found her. And it happens in this instance to be a Cuban Jewish branch of her family tree, which you could imagine could be quite hard to research. And so this is a really smart approach for her to post about it, and then the cousins found her. So just a really useful tactic. The thing with broadcasting is that it's very effective. You just have to be more patient. If you don't have a time-sensitive situation, you can just post them out there, and if you can sit back and wait, one of these days you'll just wake up to an email or a note on Twitter or Facebook or whatever that solves your mystery. This is an example of Dead Fred. In terms of the name Dead Fred, you'll have to go to the website to see what that's about. It's